People like Dr. Busak is using the Bellard Confession for gay marriage and those things. Why is your story different from that line?
Very early on in my Christian life, I was given a book by Terry Johnson, Grace Comes Home. It was a simple book that expounded the doctrines of grace. And Terry Johnson's book had a remarkable impact on me. And this must have been in probably the early 1985s. This was during the time of the school boycotts, the 85 school boycott, and the rise of the UDF and other movements like that. I'd had a bitterness and a hatred towards white people, and that needed to be dealt with. And the only thing that could change that and change the way that I approached that narrative was to embrace the doctrines of grace and see the grace that comes through the transforming work of the gospel. In Puckelsdorp, we visited a place that was for terminally ill patients, folks dying of HIV and cancer. And while we were there, I tumbled onto the bed of a man, and immediately I'd seen him, I recognized him. And he was one of those policemen that had been part of the interrogations back in the 1970s. And he was dying of emphysema in this hospital in Puckelsdorp. Obviously, when I'd seen him, I think all of the anger and the bitter, I've now been a Christian for several years, but all of the anger and the bitterness and the resentment and the misery that I'd been harboring, even though I'd been a Christian, all surfaced. He then put his hand on my hand and said to me in Afrikaans, "Asseblief meneer, kan jy vir my vergewe?" And it floored me, because in that moment, I realized that much of the tension and struggle that I'd been struggling with was not because of what had been done to me, but that much of that anger had been residing in my own heart. And his words literally cut my heart.
Friends, it's a wonderful privilege to have my good friend, Rev Neil Henry, with us here today. We met each other probably about 4 years ago. I did an online talk for them a couple of years ago, and I remember Professor Bob Yarbrough, one of my mentors from Covenant Seminary, after he retired, he contacted me one day, and they work with a Christian charity that want to reach out and give back to communities that can really benefit from good, solid evangelical reformed scholarship. And he wanted to come to Africa, and I recommended Neil Henry Bible Institute in Cape Town as one of the good options for them to come and invest some wonderful good scholarship and evangelical wisdom. And they've been coming for a bit over 6 years now, 8 years now already. Wonderful. So it's wonderful to have this connection. Prof. Bob Yarbrough, he's been a mentor for me since 2004-05 when we were at Pretoria University. We were confronted by the critical German scholarship, and he translated a German book into English, and that book was instrumental in starting a movement at Pretoria University of students not being afraid of historical criticism, but engaging it with good, solid academic counter scholarship. And that's been really a wonderful encouragement for us. And now coming to Cape Town, it's been wonderful living here now for more than a year, and we've become fairly good friends, me and Brother Neil. He's very, very busy with his leadership program. We are so grateful that he's able to talk with us today. Brother Neil, can we start by just briefly tell us where you grew up and how eventually you met the Lord?
I'm really privileged to be with you this afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody. It's a joy to have this time to engage in the launch of the Institute. We've just come back from another conference. My wife and I had been at a marriage conference up in Malmesbury. I was the speaker, so I'm a little bit anxious as I sort of settle down, so please bear with me. I grew up I was born in a township called Benoni, or a town called Benoni, in a township called Actonville back in 1959. In 1963, group areas moved us out to the area, and my dad was able to acquire a house on the West Rand in a place called, in a new development called Bosmont. And so I grew up in Bosmont, new development for colored people back in the day. And we'd had all new facilities, new stormwater drains, new roads, a new railway station, new school, etc. Family of 6 boys. I'm the third in line. 3 others were born once we moved to Bosman, but I'm the third eldest that grew up or that was born in the township of Actonville, Benoni. My dad was a civil servant. He was a school teacher and later a college lecturer. And he served on every civic association that there was. And part of what he did was he wanted to instill in us the discipline of obeying the law of the land. And so Dad taught us not to question things, that you seek to keep the peace as far as is humanly possible. We had a fairly comfortable, I would probably classify our upbringing as a middle class upbringing. We weren't wealthy, but we had what we needed. We certainly weren't in a situation where Mom would buy 1 school pencil, break it in half and sharpen the broken end so 2 of us could have a pencil. It wasn't quite as desperate as that, but we certainly lived with hand-me-downs. And our upbringing was fairly strict. Dad made sure that we were good churchgoers. I grew up in a fairly nominal Anglican environment where I served even as an altar boy. Ticked all the boxes, go to confirmation classes, be faithful, go to Sunday school. But I'd never really had a genuine Christian experience in all of that time. Right up until the time that I got to grade 9, standard 9, or grade 11, I think we regarded ourselves as reasonably comfortable in the environment that we were in without asking any questions of some of the establishments around us. And there were 2 events that happened. The one was the uprising of the students in Soweto in 1976, and the other was the death of Steve Biko. And these 2 events raised alarm bells in our minds. This was my matric year. I remember us asking our school teachers, because our school was in Bosman and overlooked, we sort of looked, Dube and Diepkloof were about 9-10 kilometers from where we stayed. And we could see the columns of smoke rising in Soweto. And we asked our teachers, what on earth is going on? What's happening with the kids in Soweto? And I'll never forget the very glib answer that we got. In fact, my biology teacher turned and just said, oh yeah, you know the black kids, they don't like school and so they burn their facilities. And something in my 17-year-old mind said, that's not right. And for the first time in my 17 years, I began to question what was really going on in the townships and why these things were happening. And so the first idea of being politically conscientized began to affect me in my late teens. So 17, 18 years old, a young man asking questions, fairly angry that things are not what they appear to be. And then of course I went to university. So the right thing to do is I wanted to avoid military training. This was during the years of conscription. I'm certainly not going to sign up to go to the SADF and go to the border. I wasn't going to become another border booty, but I certainly wanted to avoid that. And so I applied for ministerial consent and went to university. And in many middle-class colored families, you became a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, or a dentist.
Not a dominee.
No, that was never an option. And so, because we didn't like the idea of becoming Anglican priests, and so that wasn't an option. And I signed up. I went to Wits and I joined the B-Proc program, the law program there. And my first encounter was with the Black Student Society. And I ended up joining the Black Consciousness Movement, and there I became fully conscientized into that environment.
Okay. Remarkable piece of history. I was born in 1973, so I can not recall those things. Tell us, at what point did your involvement in the Black Consciousness movement become problematic? Or let's put it like this. Tell us about your first arrest and then subsequent events, how you ended up in jail, and just unpack a bit of that for people, just to give them a sense of what happened then.
You'll find some of the detail in the written account of what had taken place. It's certainly historically accurate. Landing up at Wits University, young student, very excited about being there. The only movement that we knew, and this was during the years that the African National Congress was not known. Your Black Consciousness Movement was known. SANSCO, the student organization, was known. And then you had basically three movements on the campus. You had your conservative students, that were the far left, right-wing students. Then you had the liberal group of students that were Tony Leons and Lisa Seftals. They were part of the, that's right.
Yeah.
And they were part of NUSAS, National Union of South African Students.
Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert.
That's right. And they would have been the front runners of that particular movement. Yeah. And then, of course, you had the Black Student Society that had been born right out of Black consciousness. What had happened that particular day that I got involved, there'd been the arrest of a number of students. I think they distributed pamphlets against just a regular student protest. And there was a mass meeting in the social science building. 600 students had gathered, mostly black students. And when I say black students, at that stage, anybody that was not white was classified as black. And anybody that was white and supported the anti-apartheid movement would also be part of that meeting. Walked into this meeting, students were in disarray, leaders had been arrested. Some of the key leaders had just been picked up the night before by the security police. And I couldn't understand the craziness of the disorganization of these students. And so I opened my mouth and I said, guys, why are you so disorganized? This is not difficult to do. What we need to do is call for a boycott of classes, arrange a march up to Jonathan Street Post Office, send a telegram to the then Prime Minister, and then let's plant a tree in remembrance of those who are being incarcerated. And the idea was to plant an olive tree. And the students rallied around. I walked with them. We marched up Jonathan Street. I was right in the front there leading this march. Walked into the post office. Everybody was outside. Me on the inside with 7 or 8 other students. Wrote out this telegram and then handed it to the lady behind the counter. She then took the 2 rand note, counted the number of letters, put the 2 rand note. You guys know what telegrams are, eh? Stuck the 2 rand note onto the edge of that piece of paper, and then turned and handed it to a man in shirt sleeves behind her. And that was my first encounter with somebody from the security police. I was instantly arrested. And I turned and I said to this man, you must be very foolish if you're going to arrest me knowing there are 600 angry students outside. And he went and he pushed the blinds aside and he said, "Kom kykie." And there was not one student in sight. The police had fired, I think, 2 tear gas bombs into the midst of the crowd, and the crowd had dissipated. And I was hauled off to Modderby for my first holiday experience at Modderby prison.
Now, the story is described in detail of the interrogation, the abuse. 1 or 2 things I will mention. They took him up at one point in a helicopter, blindfolded him, threatened to throw him down. That's just one story of what happened with him. And there were 1 or 2 notorious white policemen who committed some of those terrible acts on Neil Henry. And what I want to ask you, during all those difficulties, it's almost a year that you were incarcerated in total, if I remember correctly.
In total, if you add up all over a period of 3 years, there would have been 186 days. So over a period of 3 years, there have been several occasions.
Let me ask you quickly about the impact this had on you. You were humiliated, you were regarded as inferior, and can you just quickly reflect on one of those times where you lost all hope and you were on a motorbike? Tell us what happened and what images, in hindsight, God used in a remarkable way at that stage.
I'm not sure, do I tell the story of my wanting to commit suicide in there? I can't remember if I recorded that.
With a motorbike going into the...
Yeah. So after 3 years of being picked up and released, some of you may remember there was a law called, it was Section 22 of the Internal Security Act, and it was later extended to Section 29. And that Internal Security Act was the Preventative Detention Act. You could be detained for 14 days without trial, without the rights to an attorney, etc., etc. And then it was extended to 28 days. So over that 3-year period, there were intermittent periods for that time. I'd never been formally charged in all of that time. I've not ever been sentenced, and I've never stood before a magistrate for any of those things, but I'd had several of those occasions. On one of those occasions, if I might just throw this in there, one of the things that began to turn my heart was the time that I was taken home by said policeman, and we had been printing leaflets on a Gestetner machine, and the police wanted from us the silk screen that we used with the printing. And they actually took me to my mom's home. I wasn't staying at home. I'd left home and I was living on the campus at the time. And they took me home to search for the silk screen. And what followed was horrendous, because our house was searched. It was literally trashed. In all of that time, my mom didn't utter a word. She asked whether my shirt could be taken off, whether the handcuffs could be taken off so that my shirt could be changed. She bathed me with Dettol and Savlon and some soft swabs to clean up some of the bites that I had from the fleas in the prison. They then put the cuffs back on after she put a clean shirt on, and she made a mixture of milk, glucose, and honey, and helped me to try and drink this. And as she brought it up to my mouth, he'd come behind her, smacked it out of her hand. I remember the glass hitting the wall, and as I looked up, in the same way as I saw the milk running down the wall, my mom shed tears for the first time. That never left me. Sorry, I don't get emotional about these things.
That's good.
That was the first time I saw my mom break, and it broke me. I made a determination that I would walk away from this movement and the struggle in this way, if this is what it would do to my family. I could not bear to see my mother being put through that. You know, as I left, she said to me, all she said was, she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "It's okay, my boy. It's in the Lord's hands." Those were her words. I wasn't a Christian. I'd walked away. There'd been several other incidences, the deaths of a number of guys that I knew. There were some of my friends that had gone and joined Umkhonto we Sizwe. I was not militant in that sense. I was quite happy to be part of what was happening on the campus. But many of them had lost their lives at some point. They'd either been killed, blowing themselves up with limpet mines, being shot by security police, and there were a number of horrific deaths, and all of that is recorded in the TLC statements. I got to the point where, on one of those occasions, they had brought photographs, Polaroid photographs to me to show me what my friends were doing while we were sitting at Modder B or at Brixton police station. And those photographs would be pictures of the students going into Solly Kramer's, buying alcohol, going to the butcher at OK Stores in Jarrison Street, buying meat, and then going to the zoo lake for a picnic. And you cannot imagine how antagonizing that could be for you when you're there and you're being told, here's what your friends are doing. So by the time I'd walked away from there after multiple occasions like that, I was somewhat broken. More than just broken, and really determined to want to find an alternative solution. And in that depth of despair, battling with depression, battling to figure out my identity, I'd already been expelled from the university for reasons that were not politically motivated, and that's a different story for another day. But completely isolated from family, isolated from friends. And I got onto my motorbike and I decided the only thing to do is to end my life. And so here's what I would do. I want to go out in a blaze of glory. I will ride my motorbike under the freeway in End Street at the end of Johannesburg, gather up some speed, loosen my helmet, make sure the strap is not on tightly, and then race my bike up to 180 kilometers an hour and just turn it into a concrete pillar. What a wonderful way to go. That was my idea of a blaze of glory. I sat there, revved up the bike, my eyes filled with tears, and in the midst of that misery and despair, I had the image, now please don't laugh, but I had an image of a jam donut and a tin of Stoney. I don't know what prompted it, but there was this Stoney that was icy cold with the teardrops just drifting down the outside, and a jam donut, golden brown with silver sugar on the outside, and this orange apricot jam just oozing out the side. I had such a taste for it that I turned my bike around, rode back to the university because I knew the cafeteria, and to my shame, I shoplifted a donut and a can of Stoney. It lifted my spirits. I didn't commit suicide that day. By the next morning, all of the misery had come back again. And I went back to the spot again, revved up my bike, determined to ride my bike into a pillar. and I had the image a second time. So I thought, this is not going to help me, because every time I have this image, I go and I shoplift a jam donut and a Stony, and now it's gone to the third day. That's all I've lived on. I even changed the place, thinking that there must be a billboard that's triggering this image. There was no billboard. It happened on the third day again. And the image of the jam donut and Stony prevented me from taking my life. And I still love jam donuts and Stony to the day. But they've certainly, I think my heart had been so far from God that even if He'd spoken to me in an audible voice, I would not have known that it was He speaking.
Yeah. Remarkable. Quickly take us from there to how you hitchhiked to Cape Town, and briefly what happened in Cape Town the next year or two.
Yeah, things moved fairly quickly. This would have been, that would have been in the late 1970s. 81, 82, 83, just the years were tumultuous. Drifted from job to job, couldn't hold down a job at any place. Everywhere I went to, I'd be angry. I'd be angry with the bosses for some other reason, and there'd always be some politically motivated reason why I would leave. And so everywhere that I'd been, from the bank to the building society to motorcycle mechanics to civil engineering, soil testing, to being a direct salesman, marketing salesman. I sold television maintenance contracts. I've sold dinner plates with people's faces on them, and I was a very good salesman. Yeah, and from all of that, I finally got to a point where I decided that I needed a change of venue. So of course, in my unregenerate mind, I was thinking, find another place to go to. And so I stood on the side of the freeway. I handed my mom, I took everything to my mom's place. I had vehicles that were being leased. I gave her a box of car keys, gave her my clothing. I said, please donate all of this to St. Joseph's Old Age Men's Home. And I cleared out everything. And with a little barrel bag, with a pair of jeans, a couple of pairs of socks and underwear, a couple of sweaters, I stood on the freeway and I hiked to Cape Town from Grasmere, where the Grasmere Plaza is on the N2 yes. Today, N1. I hiked to Cape Town and got a lift with a Sunripe fruits truck. I had R2.37 in my pocket, because the determination was not to come and start doing the same things I'd been doing there. I came into a Christian family's home. There, I knew their sons from Johannesburg. They'd invited me to come and stay with them, which I did. I had nowhere else to go to. And that family had prayed for me. I'll never forget the first night I spent with them. We had cottage pie. And after the lady had dished the cottage pie, she said, go and sit with my husband in the lounge. I'm going to do the dishes. She went down the corridor to the bedroom. This is Portland, Mitchell's Plain, 1984, June 84. Went down the corridor, closed the door, and she prayed. She then prayed for her sons in Johannesburg that I knew. And she said, Lord, thank you for working in our children's lives. I'm glad to receive news that they're alive. But would you please rescue them, because I know that they're not up to any good. And then, Lord, this new son that you sent into my household, thank you that you brought him. Won't you rescue his soul before he perishes in hell? And I heard that. I don't think I'd heard a more startling presentation of the gospel than somebody praying for the salvation of my soul before I perish. Well, I stayed with them. Their son was out every evening, and he'd only come home at 10 o'clock at night, and so I shared a double bunk with him. Only met him on the 5th night. The first 4 nights he'd come in, I pretended to sleep. But every night this guy would get onto his knees next to the bed. And I'm going to say this in Afrikaans, because that's exactly how he prayed. He'd read a verse of scripture, and then he would pray in Afrikaans, Here, sal jy asseblief hierdie verlore vent, wat hier bo my kop slaap, sal jy asseblief sy verlore siel red, voordat hy in die hel verbrand. I had no option. But by the Friday, when he invited me to join him at youth fellowship, on my way to the youth fellowship with him, I said to him, Brian, those young people where you fellowship, where you go, are they lunatics like you? He said, what do you mean? He says, are they like you and your, I said, are they like you and your mom? You pray for everybody. He says, actually, bro, the reality is they've been praying for you for the whole week. I said, well, if that's the case, I don't think I can face them. How do I become like them so that I'm not embarrassed when I get there? He said, "Are you asking to become a Christian?" I said, "I'm not sure I am a Christian." He said, "Near, you need to be born again." I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Well, let me show you something. Read this." And he takes me through the Romans passages. Romans 3:23, 6:23, the Roman road. So he opens 3:23. He says, "Read this. What does it say?" So I said, "It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And he says, "No, man, I can read. What does it say about you?" It says, I don't meet God's standard. Read this one. "For the wages of sin is death, and the gift of God is..." And so he kept on saying, I'm not asking you to read it. I'm asking you to tell me what it says about your condition. And he led me to the Lord. And then he said to me, "Well, why don't you ask the Lord to come into your life and to save you?" And right there, he led me to Christ. I made a confession of faith, and it's not been the same since.
Yeah, praise the Lord. Remarkable story. Now, can we quickly fast forward? You then got involved with ministry. You met your lovely wife, Christian lady, got married. You've got one daughter, but you started a ministry then, working among the youth in the Cape Flats and in the jails, but also hospitals. And then you went hospital to hospital. He would shave some of the men in some of the black and colored hospitals that don't have all the facilities as the other hospitals. And then you ended up in George Hospital. Tell us what happened there.
So I met my wife in 1984 at a youth camp. I'd been taken along with those young people to a youth camp. If you want to meet a wife, go to a youth camp. It's a good place to meet a wife. We met in 84. We began our relationship in the next following year. By the end of 85, we were engaged, and by the end of 86, we were married. By then, the two of us were serving with an organization called Mission to Youth, and Mission to Youth was a multi-denominational ministry outreach that sought to reach out to folks across the Cape Flats, and particularly down in the Southern Cape and on the West Coast. And on that particular occasion, we went down to George for a weekend, a busload of us. There were 60 young people, and generally the idea was to do visitation, street ministry, open air services, truck driving, and we'd visit the hospitals and minister to folks there. In Pakkelsdorp, we visited a place that was for terminally ill patients, folks dying of HIV and cancer. And while we were there, I tumbled onto the bed of a man who I was meant to go and read scripture with, and immediately I'd seen him, I recognized him. And he was one of those policemen that had been part of the interrogations back in the 1970s. This was now the late 1980s. Things were beginning to change in the country, and many of those men had been put off to seed, put off to pasture, pensioned off. In this particular case, this man's family had abandoned him, and he was dying of emphysema in this hospital in Pakkelsdorp. I think what was ironic is that here was a former white policeman that was now being cared for by black and colored nurses, and they had no idea who this man was. Obviously, when I'd seen him, I think all of the anger and the bitter, I've now been a Christian for several years, but all of the anger and the bitterness and the resentment and the misery that I'd been harboring, even though I'd been a Christian, all surfaced. I remember going across to his bed, and all I thought was, I want to remind him that he's now getting what he deserves. I went across and I shook him, and to my shame, I shook him violently because I wanted him to know how angry I was. I asked him if he remembered me. He shrugged his shoulders, and he didn't. I then gave him the nickname that he had given me back in the 1970s, and he showed some signs of acknowledgement. He then put his hand on my hand and said to me in Afrikaans, "Asseblief meneer, kan jy vir my vergewe?" And it floored me, because in that moment, I realized that much of the tension and struggle that I'd been struggling with was not because of what had been done to me, but that much of that anger had been residing in my own heart. And his words literally cut my heart and revealed the bitterness that I'd been hiding inside. I broke down and wept. He was weeping. I remember he couldn't even push the oxygen mask back onto his face. And the whole group came across, including Trish, and they came across and they knew something was wrong, and they couldn't understand. I couldn't speak. And Trish just very carefully ushered everybody away. And even though I don't think she really knew what was going on, she knew it had something to do with something from the past. I'd not ever spoken about this man or some of the incidences to her. It was not relevant at that stage. And Trish opened her Bible and read Philippians 4. I plead with you, Syntyche and Euodia, to be at peace with one another, pleading with your fellow yoke fellow. And then she paused at a line, rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice, for the Lord is near. And I remember hearing those words, for the Lord is near. And there were two things that came to my mind. One, here I am harboring all of this bitterness and anger and resentment, and the Lord is in the doorway wanting to step into our lives. In fact, even more so, it struck me that while I'm struggling with all of these emotions, the Lord is near to in fact help me. And then of course she read all the way through the passage. Think on these things, whatever is pure and noble and upright and praiseworthy, and the peace of God which passes all understanding will be your portion. And then she went and read it the second time, and those words just resonated with me. I believe the Lord did something in that moment that helped me to see that what I needed was an opportunity to be able to make peace with this man. I don't doubt that the Lord had been at work in his life. Because when I spoke with the nurses about this man, they said to me, nee meneer, dit kan nie wees nie. Die nice man wat daar lê. Nee, die man is 'n wonderlike man. He was actually one of the sweetest patients that they'd had. And they could not reconcile some of the things that I'd said I'd known of him with the person that they then knew. He died a couple of weeks later, and Trish and I returned to be there he was given a pauper's burial, and we were there when he was buried. And we'd hoped that in some way that there might have been some dignity given to his death.
Neil, thank you so much for your willingness to share this remarkable story. And we know there are many other stories. And I want to try to wrap up and just share something with my friends that I never knew. We grew up with the stories of Dr. Alan Boesak and the Liberation Movement. And can I ask you just to finish off and tell us why the Lord took you on a different road and not the road of continuous liberation going on, where now people like Dr. Boesak is using the Bellard Confession for gay marriage and those things. Why is your story different from that line?
Very, very early on in my Christian life, I was given a book by Terry Johnson. I don't know if you folks know Terry Johnson, When Grace Comes Home. It was a simple book that expounded the doctrines of grace. Terry Johnson unpacks three major doctrines. He speaks about the doctrine of God, the doctrine of man, man and sin, and the doctrines of Christ. Yeah. And so he points out that in all of our lives, God is sovereign, God is providentially taking care of us, and all things that happen in our lives happen under God's sovereignty. A second thing is to recognize that we are broken people, and that in our sinfulness, we are in need of redeeming. And of course, the third point being that Christ is the only one who's able to give us that grace. And Terry Johnson's book had a remarkable impact on me, and this must have been in probably the early 1985s. This was during the time of the school boycotts, the 85 school boycott, and the rise of the UDF and other movements like that. Now remember, I'd had a bitterness and a hatred towards white people. Anything that represented whiteness was something that I'd be very angry with, and that needed to be dealt with. And the only thing that could change that and change the way that I approached that narrative was to embrace the doctrines of grace and see the grace that comes through the transforming work of the gospel. And I'm very thankful that even the time that I'd gone to the Bible Institute and then having some of those things affirmed and taught for me, that I've had godly teachers who were able to point me to to reform theology in many ways. And I was able to see that the enmities that I have are not because of skin color or creed or nationality, but rather the enmities that the separations that I have are between those that are righteous and those that are unrighteous. And that was probably one of the big turning points for me.
Thank you. Neil, thank you so very much for sharing this story with us. We don't often hear stories like this. And I thought, just as a small token, just a gesture of a couple of years of being your friend and your buddy in Christ and crying with him also a few times, I just want to give something very small, and I want to give it to you on behalf of all my friends who are sitting here today. If you can just sit for a second, I just quickly want to go get it, and then we'll wrap up. Is that good?
It's good with me.
Thank you.
Why does he do that?
Can I hold your hand?
Yes, of course.
Say, we thank the Lord. We thank the Lord for a doctrines of grace, reformed reconciliation on sola scriptura, and not on liberation movements and struggles, whether it's Afrikaners, whether it's the Black Liberation Movement, but reconciliation in Jesus Christ, uniting us as Jesus Christ and the apostles would have wanted us to do this. Thank you so much. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take that with me.
You take that. You give one to your wife as well.
I will do.
Okay.